In just the first 5 months of this year, South Africa's iron and steel exports to the United States marked a 27% year-on-year drop. The broader industry is now on the edge. The Steel and Engineering Industries Federation of Southern Africa warns that the tariff hike effectively nullifies South Africa's access to the U.S. market. Industry leaders say the new trade barriers could trigger significant job losses.
Many of our companies deal with the United States customers. We export vehicles, we export steel and aluminium, we export citrus. So we've got to engage with them and find a way to reach a settlement. So within the window that's still open, we're hoping that we will find a way to settle this matter. So intensive negotiations are now underway.
My people, in just a few days, thousands of African workers could be out of a job. That's right. Trump's new tariffs kicks in this August, and Africa is squarely in the crosshairs. From South Africa's citrus farms to Lesotho's garment factories, African economies are bracing for impact as a new wave of U.S. tariffs, now up to 30%, goes into effect on August 7th. For some, it means canceled orders. For others, it means factory closures, lost jobs, and economic chaos. And the timing, well, couldn't be worse, because AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, is set to expire next month. And these tariffs, they feel less like a trade policy and more like a message. Africa, you're on your own. But this moment isn't even just about Trump. It's about Africa. It's about how vulnerable our economies still are, about who controls the rules and who gets left out of the game. But also, it's about what happens when Africa decides to stop playing defense and starts changing the rules altogether. Because African nations aren't taking this lying down, no. They're pushing for new partnerships with China, with the Caribbean, with the Global South. Meanwhile, American companies are sounding the alarm too, because these tariffs, they don't just hurt Africa. They hurt U.S. businesses, U.S. supply chains, and U.S. influence. So today on The Breakdown, we're asking the real questions. What exactly are these new tariffs? Who's being hit the hardest? How are African governments and American boardrooms responding? But more importantly, could this be the moment Africa stops waiting for favors and finally starts building a trade system that works for us? Now, as painful as it is, this may just be the push that the continent needs. We're going to break it down, but first, thank you to all of our new subscribers and members. And if you haven't joined us yet, please hit subscribe, tap the alert so you never miss a new release from us, and also consider joining our membership community where you gain access to more exclusive content. And if you enjoy this episode, don't just scroll past it. Leave a comment, share with your group chats, and drop a super thanks to support our channel. All right, now, let's get into it.
Now, a 30% U.S. tariff on steel and related products has sent shockwaves through South Africa's manufacturing sector. Johannesburg-based Dynamic Fluid Control, one of Africa's largest valve makers, now fears losing access to its biggest market, the United States, which accounts for 80% of its export revenue.
We have significant exports to the United States that have been done under AGOA. And that means that we have been exporting tariff-free into the United States. Virtually every one of our valves that we make here, specialized components that go into the mines, into the water industry, wastewater, and so on. With the imposition of the tariffs, it means that on arrival in the United States, everything that gets delivered or that gets invoiced to the United States from the 1st of August onwards, we have to put up, 30% of the invoice value up front and pay it when it arrives.
So how did we even get here? right? Let's rewind to April 2nd, 2025. That's when President Trump, barely 3 months into his second term, stood behind a podium and declared Liberation Day. According to Trump, it was time for America to liberate itself from what he called decades of unfair trade practices, one-sided deals, and foreign dependence. And with that, he dropped the first bombshell, a sweeping 10% tariff on all goods entering the U.S. from countries that didn't have so-called reciprocal trade agreements. No exemptions, no special terms, no AGOA protections for Africa. And then it escalated. Trump's team then rolled out country-specific rates, and African nations were hit very hard. Lesotho, a tiny landlocked country that depends almost entirely on textile exports to the U.S., was hit with a proposed 50% tariff. South Africa was slapped with 30% on its agricultural and industrial exports. And several other African nations saw higher than baseline rates too. The tariffs were initially set to go into effect August 1st. And since that announcement, there's been a scramble. But here's the thing. Trump has already signed new trade deals with China, Europe, Brazil, even Vietnam and several other countries. But Africa, still waiting, still shut out. Now, fast forward to August 2nd, the White House quietly released a memo confirming the final tariff schedule for African countries set to kick in on August 7th. Let's break that down. Lesotho, which originally was targeted with a devastating 50% tariff, the rate has now been lowered to 15% after pressure from U.S. retailers and behind-the-scenes diplomacy. But let's be honest, right? Even at 15%, the damage is done, really. Orders have been canceled, factories have been shut down, and tens of thousands of women who stitch jeans and t-shirts for the U.S. market have lost their jobs. The government has now declared a national state of disaster. That's how serious it is. South Africa. Now, South Africa has had no relief at all. The tariff remains at 30%, hitting key industries like citrus, automobiles, steel, and wine. These sectors support hundreds of thousands of jobs. And according to analysts, up to 100,000 jobs could be lost in the next 6 months, especially in rural areas. The South African government is scrambling to implement an emergency support plan, but officials are already calling the impact severe. Now, the rest of sub-Saharan Africa, they've all been hit with a blanket 15% tariff across the board, up from the initial proposed 10%. So that includes Kenya's flowers, Ghana's cocoa products, Ethiopia's leather, Nigeria's processed goods, and many more. Now, many of these nations relied on AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which once gave them duty-free access to the U.S. market. But Trump has made it crystal clear that, hey, AGOA is on the chopping block. Unless a country signs a new one-on-one trade deal with the U.S., those preferences under AGOA, useless, gone. And so far, not a single African country has secured one, not one deal, not one exemption with the U.S.
My administration is committed to strengthening our friendships in Africa through economic development efforts that benefit both the United States and our partners. And we're working tirelessly to forge new economic opportunities involving both the United States and many African nations.
And here's the irony of all of this, right? Trump keeps saying he wants trade, not aid, with Africa. That's his mantra. But how is that supposed to happen when there's zero effort to negotiate trade deals, when entire economies are punished without a seat at the table? Real trade is built on trust and mutual respect, but right now, Africa is being handed tariffs with no dialogue, no deal, and no dignity whatsoever. But my people, this has been a wake-up call for Africa, and the continent is not sitting around waiting to be rescued. It can afford to, because while the U.S. is shutting doors, African nations are already looking elsewhere, and they're not being subtle about it. From new trade talks with China and India to strategic agreements with the Caribbean and the Global South, Africa is beginning to recalibrate. And in some corners, it's doing so aggressively. In late July, leaders from across West Central and Southern Africa met in Nairobi to fast-track South-South trade corridors with a specific focus on expanding exports to Latin America and the Caribbean. The idea? Well, if Washington wants to play hardball, fine. But Africa won't play alone. In fact, one of the most ambitious proposals on the table right now is an Africa-Caribbean preferential trade area. This would slash tariffs on food, textiles, manufactured goods, and even pharmaceuticals between the two regions, creating a new lane of economic cooperation that bypasses the traditional power centers.
Yes, we are mighty when it comes to thought leadership and advocacy because we're sovereign nations. But when it comes now to commodities and trade, we're small, and this perhaps is the greatest impetus for the region to operate more and more as a single bloc, because individual countries will not excite the interests of many. But collectively, the region agreeing to pool its resources to trade with entities or blocs is a different dynamic.
Thank you. Thank you, Prime Minister.
The proposal to establish an Africa-Caribbean free trade arrangement is currently being championed by institutions like Afreximbank and supported by countries including Ghana, Barbados, and Guyana. While no formal treaty has been signed yet, regional leaders endorsed the idea at the Afri-Caribbean Trade and Investment Forum, which took place in Grenada in July, and are now pushing toward what could become a historic framework linking the two regions together. And then there's China. While Trump was busy building tariff walls, Beijing was rolling out a red carpet. In June, China expanded its zero tariff policy to cover more than 95% of goods imported from African least developed countries. We're talking zero duties on everything from coffee and cotton to rare minerals and high-end fashion. And unlike the US, China isn't asking for bilateral negotiations, reciprocity, or political concessions. They're offering access, period. Now, whether that's a genuine act of partnership or a new form of dependency remains to be seen. And it all lies on how Africa tackles this opportunity. But what's clear is this: the trade landscape is shifting. Africa is no longer just reacting to the West. It's trying to reposition itself in the world. And if the US isn't careful, it might lose more than just influence. It might lose the entire future of African trade.
The jury is out on whether Donald Trump's trade tariffs policy will result in a stronger U.S. economy in the long run, given concerns around how the policy may impact on Americans' purchasing power.
They may work in the sense of encouraging local production, but if the market contracts, then even local production will not benefit very much. And the fear with regard to tariffs, especially if they're at a very high level, is that they will generate inflation for the American consumer and erode his buying power and cause a very sharp downturn in the United States economy.
Now, here's the twist in this whole story. Trump says he's protecting American industry. But guess what? These tariffs aren't just hurting African economies. They're hurting American businesses too. Hard. Let's take textiles, for example. Brands like Levi's, Walmart, Target, and even niche U.S. fashion labels rely heavily on garment factories in Lesotho, Kenya, and Madagascar to source affordable, ethical, and high-quality apparel. These weren't just random sourcing choices. They were the result of years of AGOA-facilitated trade relationships, investment, and trust building. But now, with tariffs as high as 15 to 30%, those supply chains are no longer cost-effective. So what happens next? Prices go up, retail margins shrink, and some companies may have to relocate production, and likely not to Detroit or Cincinnati, but to Vietnam, Bangladesh, or Mexico. In other words, the tariffs aren't bringing jobs back to America. They're just shifting them somewhere else. And it's not just textiles. The U.S. citrus industry in Florida and California is now facing retaliatory threats from African markets. Auto parts, rare earths, coffee, chocolate, even shea butter producers in Africa, all tied to U.S. importers, manufacturers, and retailers, are now at risk. Even logistics companies like FedEx and DHL, which facilitate Africa-U.S. trade, are flagging disruptions and potential revenue losses. One trade analyst put it simply, this is a lose-lose. African producers suffer, U.S. businesses lose reliable, cost-efficient partners, and China gains. So the big question is, what's the end game here? Because if Trump's goal was to strengthen U.S. competitiveness, as he says, well, then this approach might do the opposite. It undermines long-term supply chain stability, isolates the U.S. from a fast-growing market, and opens the door for rivals to step in. China, yes, but also India, Turkey, and Brazil. So while Africa braces for impact, so should American boardrooms, because this isn't just a global trade shift. It's a missed opportunity. So let's bring this home. At the center of all this turmoil, there's one big clock ticking. AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, signed into law in 2000, renewed multiple times, and set to expire this September, unless Congress acts. Now, for years, AGOA gave qualifying African countries duty-free access to the U.S. market for thousands of goods, from clothing and cocoa to cars and cut flowers. And to be fair, it did open doors. It gave rise to industries, jobs, and export revenue across the continent. But here's the truth most don't want to say out loud. AGOA was never a partnership. It was a preference. The U.S. wrote the rules. The U.S. decided who qualified and who didn't. And now the U.S. is pulling the plug midstream with no replacement in sight. So the question isn't whether AGOA will be renewed. The real question is, should Africa even want it to be? Because maybe this isn't just a crisis. Maybe this is the moment to stop depending on handouts disguised as policy, the moment to stop exporting raw cocoa and importing finished chocolate, the moment to build our own trade systems rooted in intra-African commerce, diaspora alliances, and South-South cooperation, the moment to flip the script, not just to survive global trade, but to lead in it. Because if AGOA dies and all we do is beg for another one like it, then we haven't learned anything from this, have we? But if we use this rupture to invest in value chains, infrastructure, policy alignment, and strategic partnerships beyond the West, then this could be the beginning of a whole new playbook. A playbook that's written by Africa for Africa. And for a generation that's tired of waiting to be included, it's time to include ourselves. So my people, where do we go from here? What we're witnessing right now is more than just a trade dispute. It's a moment of reckoning. A reminder that in a global economy, power isn't given, no, it's taken. One executive order in Washington and factories in Maseru go dark. One missed negotiation and citrus rots in South African ports. One policy shift and decades of economic progress start to unravel. But here's the thing. Africa is not powerless. We're not bystanders in our own story. Because while America builds walls, we can build bridges to the Caribbean, to China, to each other. We can decide that trade will no longer be about dependency, but about dignity. That we won't just export raw goods, we'll own the value chain. That we won't just be invited to tables, we'll build our own. And maybe, just maybe, this rupture was the wake-up call we needed. Because if a policy designed to punish us ends up pushing us to finally unite, industrialize, and negotiate from a position of strength, then Trump may have just handed Africa the very thing he never intended to, a reason to rise. But that choice, that future, it's up to us. So now I turn it over to you. Do you think it's time Africa wrote its own rules? Drop your thoughts below. Let's have a real conversation. That's it for today's show. Thanks so much for watching. And as always, like, comment, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Thanks for watching. I'm Sandra Babu-Boateng. Until next time, take care. Hey you! Thanks so much for watching this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, don't forget to subscribe and join the family. Also, visit face2faceafrica.com for your daily news and updates on what's going on within the global Black community so you can stay informed.